All right, so Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Inshallah, today we're going to be continuing with Surah Al-An'am. A lot of things to say about this surah. So we did do this ayah, or these ayat actually. فَقُطِعَ دَابِرُ الْقَوْمِ الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا وَالْحَمْدُ لِلَّهِ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. We also did kind of like a comparison between the psychology of a believer, the psychology of a disbeliever, and the motives behind these two psychology, and certainly the end. And to summarize what we had said, for a Muslim, of course, they would have their definition of success, their definition of sorrow, their definition of happiness, their definition of what is a goal, and their all these different areas. So, and this is extremely important because the narrative, and we were focusing about the narrative piece of it, and the reason why we were focusing on the narrative piece of it was because how, of course, the different nations, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala might squeeze them into narrow areas, whether on an individual level or whether on a national level, into probably different hardships. But of course, those hardships, it was supposed to get them into that corner of dua il-mas'ala in order to recognize and come to finding dua il-ibadah. In other words, finding Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But is that what they had found? Did they get to that conclusion? The answer is قَسَتْ قُلُوبُهُمْ. Of course, some will get to that conclusion, but you would have others will actually have قسوة القلب. They will have their hearts hardened. And the reason why their hearts hardened was because they listened to the narratives that basically distracted them from seeing the truth. This is extremely important. The narratives are usually coming in to name things, just like you're renaming possibly, somebody that is causing a fitna, calling them a celebrity, or probably a person that is bringing in, of course, prostitution, probably calling them models, probably call them, فنانين in Arabi, they would call them, kind of like stars, etc. When in reality, what they are is basically people that are bringing destruction and certainly change in people's akhlaq. So you're looking at زين لهم الشيطان, whether it's how it's publicized or whether how it's implemented on ground. So shaitan would basically bring in this change of definition, whether the change of definition in how they define success, or how they define the goals, or how they define the connection between goal and the means and the goals and the resources, etc., and how it's being used. And that's why ما كانوا يعملون. So you're looking at زين لهم الشيطان, that shaitan basically used different narratives in basically describing the different actions that they were doing. So whether we're speaking about the actions in terms of goals, or the actions in terms of resources, or the actions in terms of implementation, or the actions in terms of what they're doing, in other words, what they're doing and whether that gets them to success or not. فَلَمَّا نَسُوا مَا ذُكِّرُوا بِهِ, what they were reminded of definitely was basically La ilaha illallah. They were reminded of al-akhirah. They were reminded to review their lifestyle, etc. But of course, after they were given that tahdhir, they were given that warning, but the warning didn't work, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give them for what they had worked for, which is open more of resources, giving them of the resources that they had worked for hard for, and then certainly they will reach a certain point when they will actually find a certain level of happiness, or a certain level of getting enrichment, etc. Those resources coming at them, but then all of a sudden it would be a punishment from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that simply leads them to mubilisun. That simply leads them to that ultimate the word mublisun, ultimate sorrow, which today we would use the word depression for it. Okay, that also ultimate sorrow, that ultimate depression, that ultimate basically loss of hope. And certainly that would not necessarily be confined within a certain group. It would actually start getting into even their children, and it would affect their children, affect the nation. And that's why it said فقطع دابر القوم الذين ظلموا والحمد لله رب العالمين. And we talked about Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. قُلْ أَرَأَيْتُمْ إِنْ أَخَذَ اللَّهُ سَمْعَكُمْ وَأَبْصَارَكُمْ وَخَتَمَ عَلَى قُلُوبِكُمْ. And those are basically the most important resources that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given us, basically our hearing, our seeing, and the qalb, to basically interpret the world for us. And when we're looking at this isn't necessarily an interrogative clause. We talked about that, but this is more of an informative clause to let us know that those resources, the most important resources that we were given, are hearing, our seeing, and certainly our heart, to interpret the world around us, to help us understand the relationship between us and the world around us. In other words, to help us see the most important thing, which is La ilaha illallah, to recognize the powers of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to recognize the magnificence and certainly the authority of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That was the most important thing that we were supposed to get out of the resources. So if we're speaking about these resources, these aren't the only resources that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is referring to, but He's referring to the most important resources. If the most important resources were supposed to be getting you, man ilahun ghayrullahi ya'tikum bih, which other God, which other deity is going to be giving you back the most important resources? Well, if the most important resources are given to you by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then recognize that the other detailed resources are also given by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. انظر كيف نصرف الآيات ثم هم يصدفون. Yet, even though this was an interrogative clause, but this was an informative clause in the shape, or in the, let's say, in the form of interrogative clause, to let the person basically communicate and think on their own. What is this leading me into? How do I understand all of this? انظر كيف نصرف الآيات. And we talked about نصرف الآيات, and we said والآيات, whether we're speaking about the open book or whether we're speaking about the written book, الوحي, that is. And ثم هم يصدفون, we talked about the psychology, يصدفون, and that yes, certainly it means they would turn their back. You could talk to them, but they wouldn't even listen. And it could also mean يصدفون, where they would actually become hardened in that position. So then we said, when we promised to go back to al-Qurtubi and actually see a couple things in how al-Qurtubi would, in his tafsir, how he would talk about this ayah. قُلْ أَرَأَيْتُمْ إِنْ أَخَذَ اللَّهُ سَمْعَكُمْ وَأَبْصَارَكُمْ. Okay, so أخذ, does that mean it would be taken, or does that mean it would basically be diminished? So at the end, the inference is basically to let us know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is capable of eliminating basically these resources and basically those powers those potentials that we were given to see, to hear, to basically interpret things, etc., that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could basically take it away from us. ختم. So, but here's the thing. So why أخذ سمعكم وأبصاركم? Versus when he talked about it, so when he talked about the seeing and the hearing, he used the word akhada. So is it a given power? But when he talked about the heart, he didn't say akhada sam'akum absarakum and qulubikum. He didn't say that. But he said khatama ala qulubikum. What's the difference? So if you were to say akhada sam'akum wa absarakum, it would be taken away. Okay? But if you take away somebody's heart, they would be dead anyways. But khatama ala qulubikum would basically mean that the hearts are sealed. Wait, so when you say khatama, what do you mean by sealed? We're speaking about a certain receptor basically is blocked. And that's what khatam means. A certain receptor is blocked, and then therefore it would be sealed. So therefore, keeping in mind, that's letting us know that al-qalb is basically a number of different receptors. It would be interesting to have probably medical experts to explain to us why use the word khatama. Are there real receptors in the heart? What are we talking about? Why did it? Because al-khatam is usually used for something that that has a lot of different openings. I mean, we know that it has these four different chambers. We know that piece of it. But when you're talking about khatam, is it necessarily only speaking about those four different, what do they call them, ventricles? What do they call those four different chambers? Okay, I know we in Arabic they use the word sammam. I don't know what they you would use in English for those openings. But in the end, ختم على قلوبكم. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know that there's actually a lot more to the function of the heart than just to pump blood, but it actually has the key receptors to understanding in processing information. That's quite interesting because what we would basically think of the brain, the only area to doing that, but in the Quran, it always emphasizes that the heart is actually the place. Now, some scholars actually said il-qalb is not necessarily what you would consider as the organ heart, the area of that area of that pumps blood and all of that. But they said il-qalb is not necessarily a heart per se, but it basically means the core place. In other words, according to some scholars, il-qalb could be anywhere basically that is the core of something. So certainly even the brain can be qalb because it's inside the skull, and that would be a qalb. Okay, inside the skull, that's inside the skull, and therefore a qalb, even though that is called a dimagh, but that would still be in the metaphorical stance, that would be a qalb. So can we say khatama ala qulubikum to speak about the brain as well, and not only the heart, meaning the actual organ heart? Yes, that could also be interpreted that way as well. But could it also be the two, basically the brain and the heart? And we know that stress, for example, can affect the brain and can actually cause different strokes, etc. And how is it that high blood pressure is related to strokes, and how is it related to anxiety, and how is anxiety related to the way the heart pumps blood and etc. I mean, we know for a fact that stress and how we interpret life, basically, how we interpret life, that it has a direct relationship with how our heart functions, how our brain interpret things, how our heart interpret things, basically, or interprets things, basically has a direct relationship with how we relate with the world around us. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us, well, if those resources, whether you're talking about your hearing and your seeing taken away, or whether the receptors are blocked in your qalb, whether that was the brain or whether that was the heart, if those receptors are blocked, in other words, your ability to interpret things are basically brought to not being capable of relating with the world around you, and you would definitely want those resources to come back. Who are you going to invoke to bring them back to you? Would be basically Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. انظر كيف نصرف الآيات, and see how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala نصرف basically التصريف could mean how certain things are dispensed. That's a tasrif. When you dispense something, You are giving it a way out. And نصرف could also mean to expose something. التصريف, that you're exposing something, you're basically making it obvious, you're basically making it clear. And كيف نصرف الآيات? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used the word نصرف الآيات often in the Quran. And when we talk about نصرف الآيات, whether we're speaking about ideas being processed, dispensed, basically, and how, whether through seeing, hearing, or whether our heart, and how all of that is basically processed. In other words, the evidence itself is basically shown to the people. And the Quran actually uses, Sayyid Qutb does a very good job in his books. In just an idea, Sayyid Qutb is um, certainly, we talked about Sayyid Qutb before and how the West thinks of him as the godfather of terror, which is really stupid to say, but anyhow. Because this man, by the way, he was ill of, I think it was hepatitis. Okay. And this man was, you're talking about a really short guy, almost 5'3", so it's a pretty short guy. And he was just really writing. Okay. He was just writing. He was just an author. And he was actually specialized in Lugha Arabiya, not Islamic studies, mind you. And he wrote the book. It was called معالم في الطريق. And in his book, which was translated into Milestones. And but because he said that al-hakimiyya lillah, because he said that the real authority goes back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's why they called him the godfather of terror. But anyhow, but he actually wrote certain books because of his specialty in Lugha Arabiya, and does a really outstanding job in talking about خصائص القصص القرآني. And the books that he wrote in talking about how the communication in the Quran is used, whether it's talking to the brain in a way to let the brain question the world around them, and it's talking to the brain to let the brain basically realize the world, realize their own existence, come to a realization of the different potentials that they would have, etc. So Sayyid Qutb, in his book, he talks about how the different methods, whether it's the method of putting and laying out a story, or whether it's the method of putting in a certain question, or whether the method of probably letting the person recognize if things were eliminated, what would that mean? So, in other words, using experiment to let them experiment things, to let them analyze different things, to let them see the paradigms of things, to let them see the past and history, to let them see the future and what that led them into, etc. So those are different methods that the Quran uses, and that's why when he said نُصَرِّفُ الْآيَاتِ, we're speaking about tasrif al-ayah, in other words, how different verses would have different ways and different methodologies, that is, to help the people recognize the way to truth, help the people recognize how they would analyze the world around them. So whether it's through a story, or whether it's through seeing basically the different data that they had in history, or whether it's through asking them questions and letting them basically think of the answers and think of the questions, and whether it's basically provoking certain sentiments and provoking certain sentiments, or certain things, of course, within their fitra, or within their instinct to question different things. So those are basically different methods of tasrif al-ayat. And I think Sayyid Qutb, not a Sayyid, but I always use a Sayyid. But anyhow, Sayyid Qutb actually did an outstanding job in analyzing the different methods that the Quran uses in his book Khasa'is al-Quran. And it's quite interesting in how he basically analyzes the Quran and analyzes the methodologies used. And why is that important? That's important because it's the methodology that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was teaching us in order to make da'wah. To make da'wah. Like when you want to reach to the hearts of people, these are the methodologies that the Quran uses. So use these methodologies. So it would be important in classes for the classes that are teaching Islamic studies or probably the methods of da'wah to basically go back to these books that analyze the methods that are used in the Quran. The methods that are used in the Quran. ثم هم يصدفون. Let's see what al-Qurtubi wanted to say. He said when he was talking about the hearing and the seeing, he wanted to say that this was really wanting to expose al-jawarih. In other words, the different, whether it's extremities or whether we're talking about the different sentiments or the different senses that one has. And that's basically telling them and not making it exclusive to these senses, but it's basically letting the people know. This is what al-Qurtubi was noting from other mufassirin, that this wasn't exclusive to the hearing and the seeing, but that was the most apparent sense that they would recognize. But it was to let them know that the different senses are basically given to them by the Lord Almighty. And therefore, that's basically another ayah that used the same idea, the same concept. Because another ayah said, من قبل أن نطمس وجوها. They said another ayah in Surah An-Nisa, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, before we would do it-tams. What is it-tams? It-tams is basically to wipe out any what is uh, any what is the word that I could use? Ma'lam. In Arabic, we would say ma'lam, any appearance or any sign of or any indication of something. So, and that would be what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had warned, that their faces would basically be wiped. But it wouldn't mean to wipe, meaning wiping like you would wipe your face. No, it would mean that it's taking away any sign or any basically distinction of how that there would be a face basically that contains a nose, an eye, etc. In other words, that would basically be eliminated right there. So the scholars that said that this is not necessarily exclusive to those senses, that was their evidence. They said, well, here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that it would be like wiping away and totally eliminating anything on the face, and the face acts basically as the most important area that contained the senses, whether we're speaking about the faces containing hearing, we're speaking about containing seeing, we're talking about containing the mouth, etc. All these different areas basically act as the key area to helping us recognize the world around us. The world around us where we could relate with it, with seeing, hearing, tasting, communication, etc. So natumisa wujuhan. How is that related to all of that? Well, that's basically telling us that if someone is not using their key resources are key sentiments to discovering and recognizing one, who they are. Why who they are? How did you get there? Because al-wajh is usually the place of identity. Al-wajh is the place of identity. Because al-wajh is the place of identity. If the place of identity is taken away, and what is the place of identity? Your resources. If you're not capable of using the most important potential to help you recognize your place of identity, which is your face, which is who you are, then you had really lost the most important key of where are you going. If you don't recognize who you are and using those resources that you were given, and you're not capable of recognizing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then you cannot really recognize who you are. How is that so? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most important, one that is the most apparent in this whole universe. It's his power basically is surrounding you everywhere. If you're not recognizing his power, then you're not recognizing why you exist, who made you exist, and why you're and what you're supposed to be doing. That's going to be your wajh. That's going to be your face. Your face marks your identity. If you're not capable of seeing where you're going, you're not capable of recognizing what you were created for. You're not capable of processing using your most important potentials, the resources that you have. You're not processing the most important thing about yourself, then your wajh is basically empty of any connection with the world around it. The identity is completely distorted. The identity is completely distorted. And that's why it's quite interesting when you look at al-wajh. There's a special emphasis in the Quran talking about the face and how the face would basically mark not only the identity, but the face itself marks as the most important resource to help you recognize your relationship. And if you look at, this is my own inference. If you were to look at, there is a book that was written by Ibn Taymiyyah. It's called اقتضاء الصراط المستقيم. The book is quite big, by the way. The book, it is almost in 300 pages, somewhat, almost 300 pages. And what he talks about, and it's a very important book, and I think that that book is probably one of the most important books that needs to be translated during our time, but not fully translated. It's definitely going to be too big for many to, I would say, absorb, but I would say summarized and translated. Anyhow, what is the book about? The book basically talks about preserving the Muslim identity. But one key thing that the book emphasized in preserving the Muslim identity is how dangerous it is for any Muslim to embrace the cultures, the kafir cultures, basically, the cultures that surround them, whether it's the cultures of al-fasiqin, or whether it's the cultures of al-kuffar, or whether it's the cultures of al-zalimin. Why are we using al-zalimin, al-fasiqin, and al-kafirin? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if you look into the ayat, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَاللَّهُ لَا يَهْدِي الْقَوْمَ الظَّالِمِينَ. Another ayah, وَاللَّهُ لَا يَهْدِي الْقَوْمَ الْكَافِرِينَ. وَاللَّهُ لَا يَهْدِي القوم الفاسقين. Why these three? So aren't they contradictory? No, it's not contradictory. It's letting us know that if a person is zalim, what is a zalim? Basically a person that goes beyond the limits that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had considered as the limits of truth. If a person goes beyond the limits of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, beyond the paradigms of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then that person basically led themselves to a place where they would be lost from recognizing their own identity. And that's why the ayah was saying, من قبل أن نطمس وجوها. So الظلم is also one thing that can affect the senses, that can affect the faces. So, in other words, whether we're talking about dhulm, in other words, transgressing the limits with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or whether we're talking about fisq, transgressing the limits by far and continuously transgressing the limits, or whether we're talking about kufr, it will affect your appearance. It will affect how your senses are processing the world around you. It will affect the receptors in your body, including the heart. This is extremely important because that's what that A is basically putting in that inference of. That if the person's identity, whether what they're looking at, whether what they're hearing, and on how their heart is processing all that information that surrounds them, that's going to be affecting their identity. And in the book اقتضاء الصراط المستقيم, Ibn Taymiyyah focuses on that piece of it and says that one very important thing that the hadith are telling us not to do is imitate, whether it's the kuffar and what they're seeing, or whether it's the zalimeen and how they're living their lifestyle away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, distant from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, etc. And whether we're speaking about the lifestyle. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ, "Man tashabbaha biqawmin fahuwa minhum." The Prophet ﷺ had said, whoever imitates any group of people, then he's part of them. In other words, the way that you dress, the reels, the different YouTube videos that you would be watching, that lifestyle is definitely going to be affecting the way that you process the information in your heart about your own identity. And this is something especially for the teenagers. Got to be careful about. If you look at the ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تَرْكَنُوا إِلَى الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا. وَلَا تَرْكَنُوا إِلَى الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا. What does that? And فَتَمَسَّكُوا بِالنَّارِ, he says. What is وَلَا تَرْكَنُوا? الركون is السكون. السكون is basically when you're silent about something, you're quiet about something, you're basically idle about something. But he said, إِلَى الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا. So what does that mean? When you're seeing people transgress the limits, but you're just quiet about it, or you're probably just looking at it. Are you engaging in it? You're not really engaging. You're not yet part of it. But just by staying quiet about it, not resisting it. That's the key thing. Not resisting it, not recognizing that I'm not part of this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تَرْكَنُوا. If you are not resisting it, if you're not active and you're not actively opposing dhulm or oppression or transgression against the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then you are part of it. That's what that ayah is basically inferring. If you're not standing against it, if you could be just watching a video, you could be just probably listening to a conversation, and you recognize that there's something wrong there, but you're just silent about it, then you're part of it. In other words, what happens? The receptors within your heart, that's the first stage. Receptors within your heart, they basically had embraced all of this. You didn't recognize that it was putting an influence on your heart. That actually takes me to Surah Al-Hadid. In Surah Al-Hadid, let's look at this ayah in Surah Al-Hadid. Okay, and we're going to go to Surah Al-Hadid. Remember the page that we're on. The page that we're on is 142. Let's go to Surah Al-Hadid really quick. Okay, it's a Surah Qaf, and we're just a couple surahs away. Here we go. Here's Surah Al-Hadid right there. Let's look at it in Surah Al-Hadid. This is Surah Al-Waqi'ah. Let's look at it in Surah Al-Hadid because this is extremely important. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically tells us, where is that? Is it in Surah Al-Hadid? Yes, it is. I know it is. I can't find it. Can't believe it. Ya Allah. Wanted you to see ألم يأن الذين آمنوا أن تخشع قلوبهم لذكر الله وما نزل من حق ولا يكونوا كالذين أوتوا الكتاب من قبل فطال عليهم الأمد فقست قلوبهم وكثير منهم فاسقون. So that's one thing. But it starts actually right there. ينادونهم. ألم نكن معكم. So what happened? Look at this right there. You see, so this ayah is basically telling us when you would see the believing men and the believing women, their light is basically radiant in right before basically their hands, their rights, and then they would be told glad tidings. Today you would basically get the Jannat and tajri min tahtiha al-anhar. You would get the gardens, the with the water flowing underneath it, and you would be living there eternally. That is the magnificent victory. And then on that day, the hypocrites, the hypocrite men and the hypocrite women would tell the believers, انظرونا نقتبس من نوركم. Uh, just wait for us, or also طالعونا, look at us, or just wait. It's basically going to just wait for us. It's going to, in other words, radiate upon us too, and we're going to get some of your light. But that's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, ارجعوا وراءكم. Go back, and you're basically not going to be getting any of their light. فَالْتَمِسُوا نُورًا. Then, of course, let's see what light you're going to be getting. But then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically puts a wall in between the munafiqeen and the believers. But the wall would have on one side, the believers would see rahmah in it. On the other side, the zalimeen would only see it's basically containing something that is adhab, torment. But here's the key thing. Then the munafiqeen would call out, weren't we a part of you? And they said, Bala, you were a part of us at one point. In other words, a part of you in dunya. We attended Quran class together. We went to the masjid together. But then, ولكنكم فتنتم أنفسكم. I want you to look at this one. What is فتنتم أنفسكم? How does that happen? فتنتم أنفسكم basically means that you are the ones that got yourself into that fitna, got yourself into the fitna, got yourself into confusing your path, got yourselves into losing the interpretation of things. فتنتم أنفسكم. What's a fitna? Fitna is basically a delusion. You got yourself into the delusion. How? You brought it to yourself. You exposed yourself to it. You took yourself into that corner, basically. And then continue. تربصتم. What is تربصتم? There was something that you had seen. You looked at it. You basically related with it without you realizing, you exposed yourself to it. This is important. Exposed yourself to it. You followed, you traced the fitna. Then you looked at it and you exposed yourself to it. And then that led you to that doubt. It confused you. Your receptors, they basically started getting blocked one at a time. Then you lived in their hopes. This is key to knowing if any of us are within these areas, then you really got to get back, because this ayah is basically telling us the steps of how the munafiqeen might at one point be with the believers, but then all of a sudden their life changes and they're basically away. What happened? فتنتم أنفسكم. They were the ones that exposed themselves to the area of من تشبه بقوم فهو منهم. That was the start. They wanted to mimic their lifestyle, and then that was the start. And then it continued. تربصتم. They continued in thinking that, hey, this is going to lead me to success. This is going to lead me to happiness. And then they started basically living this fake feeling, this fake hope. And then wartabtum. Then that led them to then questioning Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, questioning Islam. Then they started confusing themselves. Why? Confusing themselves into the different shubuhat. In the beginning, it was just just wanting to see it. Curiosity. So you got to be really careful with what words you would use. Remember اقتضاء الصراط المستقيم was telling you, well, the way and how you mimic the people around you. Are you mimicking salihin? How do we mimic salihin? Yes, what kind of words are you using? When you get angry, when you are quiet, what are you listening to? What are you looking at? When you're sitting alone, what are you watching? When you're with people, what are you watching? When you're around people, what type of friends are you surrounding yourself with? What type of clothes do you wear? Who do you want to be like? Who are you impressed by? What impresses you? And that's why, if you were to look at a very key thing in Al-Aqidah Tahawiyya, he does an outstanding job in Aqidah Tahawiyya. He basically lines out and 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 and, and lets us know that, when you look at loving for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then loving for the Prophet, and then loving Sahaba, and then why even use the word love? Because when you love something, you basically, one, relate to it. It becomes a part of you. Okay? That's number one. Number two is that when you speak about loving Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if you love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then you would basically focus on everything that leads you to Allah. So loving the Prophet ﷺ is basically from loving Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why do I love the Prophet ﷺ? Because he was the one that even I recognized that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had chosen to deliver his message. I should love him too. Then the love for Salihin, for the Sahaba. Why? Because the Prophet ﷺ, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, radiyallahu anhum, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, radiya, in Surah Al-Fath. What is that in Surah Al-Fath about that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically radiyallahu anhum, what is that in Surah Al-Fath in regards to those that yubay'unaka tahta shajara, okay, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically was content over them. Okay, so what is that telling us? That if the Prophet ﷺ was content over them, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was content over those Sahaba, then my love for the Sahaba is basically because Jannah loves them. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that they were accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's basically why I would love the Sahaba. But I say at the same time, my love for ulama, for the scholars. Why am I loving the scholars? And beautifully, Tahawi emphasizes that one and emphasizes that love for ulama is basically coming from the love for those that carry the legacy of al-Anbiya, carry the legacy of a Sahaba, carry the legacy that leads us to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if you're looking at the same thing, you're looking at, I'm doing a comparison here. So if we're speaking about that a mu'min, their love for the ulama, their love for the companions, their love for the anbiya, all of that leads to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the same thing. You're talking about on the other side, the love for possibly the celebrities, basically leading to fitna. The love for certain political figures, for certain Hollywood stars, for certain, I don't know, models, whatever it is, that's basically taking us to that fitna. It's either going to lead, منكم ما يريد الدنيا ومنكم ما يريد الآخرة. It's either that you wanted الدنيا or you wanted الآخرة. It's basically going to determine your identity. What identity do you embrace? That's basically right there. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us in this ayah, وَلَكِنَّكُمْ فَتَنْتُمْ أَنفُسَكُمْ, that was the start. The start was you wanted to trace that area of shaitan. That was the start. It basically put you in a delusion that it was exciting and it was interesting. That was the fitna. That's the start. And then tarabbastum. But then you went to continue looking at it. You went to listen to it. You went to let your identity, basically little by little, your senses basically trace that and follow that. And that was tarabbastum. Tarabbus is usually to see something. All right. التربص is usually to see something. But التربص, certainly you could say right there, he said, well, their tarabbus was basically, it can be to see something in where they were basically wanting to await that any calamity would happen to the believers. That was one thing that they were waiting for. But there's also another type of tarabbus where, of course, their senses we're looking at the different areas of fitna. That's the general meaning. Looking at different areas of fitna. And then wartabatum. And that led them to that riba. That led them to the misconceptions. In other words, in the beginning, it was wanting to be a part of another group. That was the munafiqeen. Now, on Judgment Day, because they were not part of the mu'mineen, that's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would say, no, you can't be part of the mu'mineen, and we're going to put a wall to separate the two. نسأل الله العفو والعافية. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us part of the mu'mineen, Ya Rabbi. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would give them light in their faces, light above them, and light on their right, and light that surrounds them everywhere. Allahumma ameen. وغرتكم الأماني حتى جاء أمر الله وغركم بالله الغرور. غرتكم الأماني. What is الأماني? What is الأماني? Many are basically just different hopes. And when we're speaking about identity is basically involving what you realize about yourself, what you think of yourself, what you put yourself into, and certainly what is being processed in your brain. And certainly, finally, that is going to determine your hopes, your identity about yourself is determined based on the mission that you carry. Based on the mission that you carry. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is right there. Let's go back to that ayah that we were doing. Oops. I thought I got the right page. Anybody remember what page it was? Let's see. Oh dear, I lost the page. Hold on, let's see what that was. I found it. Okay, here we go. You guys gotta remember it's 142. Okay, so قل أرأيتم إن أخذ الله سمعكم وأبصاركم وختم على قلوبكم. Now, of course, for Qurtubi, at least he quotes some of the mufassirin saying that this is actually related to different senses. من إله غير الله يأتيكم به. And we went in details. من إله غير الله. This isn't necessarily here interrogative clause, but it was an informative clause to let them think, to let them know. And when you look at أرأيتم, أرأيتم is not necessarily what they see, but this is to basically recognize that there are two visions. There's the vision to see things with your own eyes, and there's another vision, which is your brain and what your brain processes. This is very important because many times we don't take what we see seriously, especially during our times when we would have access to seeing things like never before on basically our phones, our smartwatches, or probably laptops, computers, whatever it is, all these different things. And right now, like never before, our eye had become a dangerous place of fitna, even more than the hearing, by the way. Even more than the hearing. It's quite interesting. I was actually talking to my my kids' teachers, and one teacher really brought something to my realization and told me that she had noticed that the children in their writing, that they would write in short sentences, and the sentences would basically jump from one topic to another. And she said that she didn't see that before, but with her experience, she said that that's basically perhaps coming from the way that they would watch the reels and the shorts, and how it's basically giving in short clips. And she said even the writing is basically coming in short clips. It's short clips after short clips, and usually those conjunctions to connect these short clips are usually missing. It's quite interesting how it's affecting even the writing that the children. It's quite interesting. I never realized that whatsoever. And making those short clips. I wonder if my lecture is coming in short clips as well. We're living into these short clips, and then right now we're seeing a lot of these short clip style is affecting our way of thinking, our vision, right? Affecting our vision, affecting the way we speak, affecting the way we relate with the with the world around us. And then, of course, these short clips are basically the areas that might actually affect our own identity, where we don't have uh, the patience to even relate to a longer clip. Why? And this is really dangerous because طلب العلم requires patience to listen and to relate to the longer clips, to the longer, to the longer, uh, let's pieces of information, how we relate this data to the to the bigger picture, basically. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, telling us about السمع, telling us about hearing, about seeing. من إله غير الله يأتيكم به, who's basically another deity. Is there another deity that is going to be bring you your Lord Almighty, giving you basically your potentials, and certainly that انظر in what you see, basically relating to how you think and how you process ideas. ثم هم يصدفون, meaning that they would basically يعرضون. They would turn away, not wanting to process the data, not wanting to process the information, and therefore they would basically turn away from it. وما نرسل المرسلين إلا مبشرين ومنذرين فمن آمن وأصلح فلا خوف عليهم ولا هم يحزنون. وما نرسل المرسلين إلا مبشرين ومنذرين. What is التبشير? التبشير is basically الترغيب. In other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala giving you different different ways to encourage you. That this is the targhib. Targhib basically means encouragement, whether to encourage you that you will get to Jannah, or encourage you that you would live happy, but is that fake encouragement or is that real encouragement? That's real encouragement. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only speaks of haqq, only speaks of haqq. Or tarhib. What is it, tarhib? Tarhib is basically to warn somebody, or to basically tell them of something that is scary that is about to come. That's a tarhib. In other words, when we're doing da'wah, we need to use both methods, at-targhib and at-tarhib. It's not enough to use the method, especially, for example, when as parents talking about raising and parenting and raising our children. It's important to let the children definitely use the method of it-targhib. If you clean the dishes, if you keep your room clean, this is what you would get. But is it always? And just keep in mind that the less mature the person is, the faster they would expect the reward. The faster they would expect the reward. And that's why if you look at the different studies would basically tell us that if you want to give a reward, don't rush in giving the reward, but let them recognize to expand their maturity. If you wash the dishes, it's not right when you finish the dishes, but no, later on, it's okay, I'll give you the reward. Let them feel that there is a time lapse that they would have to wait for, because that's expanding their maturity, and that not necessarily every time you do something right that you would basically have to get a reward, an instant reward for it. Having some time lapse till they get the reward is basically expanding their maturity. And that's the same thing. You don't necessarily get the reward for your dhikr, the reward for your salah right away. You don't necessarily get everything right away. There's going to be a time lapse. That time lapse, same thing with Jannah, there's going to be that time lapse. What is that going to create in the person? That's going to create in the person that you do and you implement the principle, not necessarily for the reward, but it feels good to embrace the good feeling of doing what is right. That's the key thing. To embrace that I did the right thing, and therefore recognizing that sensation of being happy, of being proud of oneself. I managed to do this, and not necessarily for the actual reward. That's one thing to raising in children. Don't rush in giving them the reward. Let there be some time lapse for them to basically process a feeling that you don't necessarily have to get an instant gratification, an instant reward right away, and that sometimes we need to expand their maturity by having them recognize that not every good thing that you would have to get the reward right away. This is extremely important. The more mature the children are, in other words, if you're talking to probably a 14-year-old, you might want to say, okay, by the end of this month, this is what your reward would be. If it's probably, 15-year-old or 13-year-old, 14-year-old, by the end of the semester, if you do a straight A's, this is what you would get. By the end of this week or whatever it is, try to expand the area of, let's say, more consistency and more determination. And therefore, you are working on getting, let's say, an identity in place, and to realize that it's not instant gratification that you would be getting, but I want you to be consistent for a longer period of time in order to instill an identity of determination, an identity of consistency, and then finally the reward. And this is extremely important. So when you look at, even you see the university students, when is the reward going to be? Oh, it's probably 4 years from the day that they would probably start their degree. 4 years later. And it's a degree. Yeah, you probably got your bachelor's in this, or and it doesn't really, mean that you got a job, and that's why many would actually go into depression after graduating, because they would realize, like, okay, I worked 4 years for this, and all of a sudden now, okay, I got it, but I didn't really see a change. But that's because they were looking at that as the goal and not necessarily a tool. Okay, so just realizing this piece of it, realizing that you don't necessarily have to get the reward right away, but with the targhib, in order to maintain that consistency in the principle that we carry. فمن آمن وأصلح فلا خوف عليهم ولا هم يحزنون. We talked about this one. قل لا أقول لكم عندي خزائن الله ولا أعلم الغيب ولا أقول لكم إني ملك إن أتبع إلا ما يوحى إلي قل هل يستوي الأعمى والبصير أفلا تتفكرون. So what does that mean? And say, I do not tell you that I have khaza'inullah. What is al-khaza'in? Al-khazina is basically the safe, is basically the treasure box, is basically what you would keep the most valuable items in. That's al-khazina. Okay. But here it was basically saying, well, I don't have the treasures or what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically keeps in hidden, basically the most valuable things. وَلَا أَعْلَمُ الْغَيْبِ. In other words, is this talking about rizq? Why is it, how did we get there? Well, that's because there was this question when al-Anbiya wal-Mursaleen were sent, then the disbelievers said, well, if you have the ability to maintain security and remove fear and make us all be happy, then why are you living in poverty then? Why are you living yourself as basically persecuted? Why couldn't you remove that off yourself? So the prophets would respond and that they would basically not have the powers of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that لا أقول لكم عندي خزائن الله. I don't have the powers. I don't have the secrets to basically the different provisions out there, and I don't have the knowledge to knowing the future, and I don't tell you, and I'm not telling you that I'm an angel, but إن أتبع إلا ما يوحى إلي. I would only follow what was revealed onto me. So wait a minute, let's look into these. خزائن الله, al-Ghaib, and Malak. So if you say, I don't have khaza'inullah, I don't have the provisions that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically controls, okay? And when you say khaza'inullah, you're talking about the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's basically to say what? That's basically to let the people that are hearing this recognize that the prophets and the messengers, they don't control anything in the world, and they are basically human beings, and therefore we cannot glorify them to the levels of the Lord Almighty. That's one thing. Because they don't have the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's number one. What are they? Well, they were basically prophets and messengers to deliver the information about the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's number one. وَلَا أَعْلَمُ الْغَيْبِ. In other words, and that's basically to let those that would worship people, worship prophets or worship messengers or worship certain awliya, know that if the prophets and the messengers don't have the key, not to the powers of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and not even know the future, if the prophets and messengers don't know the future, well, neither do fortune tellers, neither do anybody basically claiming whatever it is have al-ghaib. Ilm al-ghaib is only exclusive to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَلَا أَقُولُ لَكُمْ إِنِّي مَلَكٌ. And I'm not telling you that I'm an angel. What is the inference? Why would they say, and I'm not an angel? Why would they emphasize that they're not angels? One thing is that to them, they used to think that the angels were banatullah. They used to think that the angels were basically the daughters or the harems, basically, that are around Allah Almighty. That's what they basically had considered about angels. So they said, well, and we're not angels. In other words, we don't have supernatural powers as angels. We're human beings like you, and therefore we basically have one duty in attabi'u illa ma yuha ilay. We would only have one duty, which is to follow what was revealed onto them by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. قُلْ هَلْ يَسْتَوِي الْأَعْمَى وَالْبَصِيرُ. But say, and ask them, is a person that is blind equal to a person that is capable of seeing? أفلا تتفكرون? Do you not think? Let's see right there. الخزائن, he said everything that basically things are kept in, and the Prophet ﷺ had actually mentioned فإنما تخزن لهم ضروع مواشيهم أطعماتهم أيحب أحدكم أن تؤتى مشربته فتكسر خزانته. What is this referring to? The Prophet ﷺ had mentioned and talked about ضروع مواشيهم. الضروع المواشي were basically you would have maybe cows, maybe sheep, okay? And certainly the milk glands are basically filled with milk. And if somebody is to milk these cows, these sheep or camels or whatever it is that gets milked, and it doesn't belong to them, the Prophet had mentioned that that gland, if that cow or if that animal belongs to someone else, then milking them and not having the permission is basically equal and equivalent to somebody basically having their own safe or their own treasure box basically broken. That would be equivalent like that. In other words, anything that preserves someone's wealth is basically a khazan. Anything that preserves someone's wealth is basically a place of khizana. What is al-khizana? Is basically what preserves something. And of course, khaza'inullah, is it referring to provisions only? No, it would refer to the powers of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as well. And therefore, this is to let them know that the prophets and the messengers, that the most important thing that they were delivered and sent to do was basically deliver the al-wahi. That's the most important thing that they were asked to do, is in attabi'u illa ma yuha ilay, that even the prophets and the messengers, their duty was to do one thing, which is to follow al-wahi. But here's a question. He was actually, that is al-Qurtubi, he was talking about one important debate that scholars debated. Can prophets and messengers actually make their own ijtihad? Can they make their own ijtihad? Can they make their own ijtihad? Can they make their own ijtihad? In other words, make their own qiyas? Can they make their own analogy? And their analogy and their ijtihad basically becoming that place of legislation for us? Yes or no? So that's a debate that scholars debated, but you would see that it is, al-Qurtubi had said that it is possible that al-Anbiya could make their own ijtihad, in other words, their own analogy, and their own analogy become basically one of the resources that basically becomes a place of legislation. So just using in attabi'u illa ma yuha ilay, it doesn't mean that prophets and messengers are completely, let's say, not related to what al-wahi is saying. So it's not that they're just messengers to pass on the information, but they too can act as legislators as well because of what they had thought. And if legislation goes wrong, that's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would interfere and intervene right there and say, no, Ya ayyuhan nabi, la tuharrim ma ahallallahu lak. Prophet of Allah, don't regard something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had regarded as halal as haram. So in other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whenever the analogy would basically go wrong, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would intervene right there. But the Prophet's analogy would definitely become a resource for legislation. So it's not exclusive in attabi'u illa ma yuha ilay, but ma yuha ila al-Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam could be also what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had approved of the Prophet and the Messenger. What Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had approved is basically when we would know that it was done by the Prophet ﷺ and nothing had been sent to tell us that that was not something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala approves of. قل هل يستوي الأعمى والبصير. الأعمى والبصير meaning the blind and the one that sees. But this isn't necessarily this isn't because we would all know that a person that is blind and the person that is capable of seeing, that they're not alike. We already know that. But this A is basically giving that metaphor that al-a'ma is basically a kafir. A person that is blind is a person that is a kafir. Why would they be called blind? Because they had the potentials, they had the resources, but they didn't use them. What were those resources? The resources on their face. The resources on their faces. And certainly, did they use these resources? Did they process their identity, who they are, what they're living for, who they're living for, who created the world around them? Did they relate to that? No, they didn't. If they didn't relate to it, then they're blind. They don't even recognize their own identity. They don't recognize who they are. They don't recognize their Lord Almighty, and therefore they don't recognize themselves. Wal-basir. Al-basir is basically a metaphor. It literally means the person that is capable of seeing. But al-basir here is a metaphor to refer to the believer. Al-basir referring to the believer. أفلا تتفكرون. And then of course الأعمى والبصير. Some scholars said that it basically refers to al-alim and al-jahil, meaning the ignorant person and the person that has the ilm. And that أفلا تتفكرون, basically that you process the idea, you process these two contrast things, and then you would recognize that they cannot be equal. If they cannot be equal, then the implication on Judgment Day is not going to be the same. If they're not equal in how they process things, then they're not going to be equal in how they live their life. Then at the end of the day, and at the end of life, their life is not going to be going into the same result and the same consequence. It's going to be a completely different route. وَأَنذَرْ بِهِ الَّذِينَ يَخَافُونَ أَن يُحْشَرُوا إِلَىٰ رَبِّهِمْ. And inshallah, we'll continue this tomorrow. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نستغفرك ونتوب إليك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت. Oh, let's say right there. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, inshallah. And if you would prefer that we would